This is the way Michael Jackson's little sister, Janet Jackson.
All my friends would say to me, God, you've changed, and in a positive way.
She stood under the brightest lights in Las Vegas, accepting an award that the entire music industry agreed she deserved, and instead of giving the kind of polished, rehearsed speech that stars usually deliver at moments like that, she said something that stopped the room cold. She said that for the first time in her life, she finally felt free. Not successful. Not grateful. Free. That one word, coming from a woman who has spent nearly 6 decades in the public eye, carried more weight than most people understood. Because freedom is not something you talk about unless you spent a very long time without it. Janet Jackson has been one of the most recognizable names in music since before most people alive today were born. She has sold hundreds of millions of records, headlined world tours that broke attendance records, and built a catalog that shaped the sound of pop, R&B, and dance music for 4 straight decades. But behind all of that, behind the choreography and the chart positions and the magazine covers, there was a story she had never fully told. A story that started long before the fame, in a small house in Gary, Indiana, where 10 children shared cramped rooms and a father whose ambitions ran deeper than his patience. What Janet finally began to share with the world, carefully and on her own terms, is that the version of her life people thought they knew was only part of the picture. The real story is older, harder, and far more complicated than any single headline ever captured. Janet Domita Jo Jackson came into the world on May 16, 1966, as the 10th and youngest child of Joseph and Catherine Jackson. The family lived in a 2-bedroom home on Jackson Street in Gary, Indiana, and life there was tight by every measure. Jo Jackson worked at a steel mill and brought home modest wages. Catherine held the household together with deep religious faith and quiet determination. There was not much space, not much money, and not much room for anything other than survival. But Jo Jackson had dreams that survival could not contain. He had tried and failed to make it in music himself, and that failure did not leave him quietly. It transformed into something else entirely. He redirected every ounce of that hunger toward his sons, drilling them through rehearsals that were less about joy and more about production. By the time the Jackson 5 signed with Motown in the late 1960s, the family's trajectory had already changed permanently. The boys were becoming stars. The household was becoming something between a home and a factory. Janet was barely old enough to walk when that transformation began. She watched from the edges of rehearsals where mistakes were punished physically, where belts and cords were tools of correction, where the standard was perfection and the consequence of falling short was pain. She was not being groomed for stardom yet. She was simply a little girl absorbing an environment that taught her very early that love and fear could exist in the same room at the same time. By the time she was 5 years old, the anxiety had already taken root. She would bang her head against walls when the pressure became too much. She developed a deep fear of performing, of getting things wrong, of being seen and found lacking. These were not childhood quirks. They were early signs of what prolonged stress and emotional instability do to a developing mind and body. And then there was what happened inside the family itself, beyond the rehearsals. Her brothers mocked her relentlessly about her appearance and her weight. They gave her cruel nicknames that no child should ever hear directed at themselves. What made it cut even deeper was that Michael, the brother who would go on to become the most famous entertainer in history, participated in that cruelty too. Janet laughed some of it off on the outside. But those words planted seeds of shame and insecurity that grew slowly underground for years. She spent decades chasing an image of herself that felt acceptable because the one she was given at home never was. As the 1970s moved forward, Janet was gradually pulled into the family's professional world. She appeared on television alongside her siblings, took part in variety show sketches, and began performing in front of audiences. But her father's hand was on all of it. Jo Jackson managed the family's career with absolute authority and very little regard for individual desire. Janet did not choose performing. It was chosen for her. Her first single came out in 1978 when she was 11 years old. Her debut album followed in 1982 when she was 16. Both were shaped almost entirely by other people's decisions. She had a label, she had a schedule, she had a name that guaranteed attention, but she did not yet have a voice. Not her own. The albums reflected the machine around her more than the person inside it. Television helped her build a fan base during these years. She appeared on popular shows and became a familiar face to audiences across the country. But even that visibility carried a familiar tension. The warm, likable young woman people saw on screen was performing a version of herself that had been edited and approved before it ever reached them. Then came a relationship that would change everything, though not in the way she hoped. James DeBarge entered her life during a period when Janet was quietly desperate for something that felt like her own choice. They married in secret in 1984 when she was 18. It was impulsive, yes, but it also made complete sense for someone who had never been allowed to decide much of anything for herself. The marriage was an act of defiance dressed up as romance. It collapsed within a year. Drug problems and instability tore through whatever promise the relationship had carried. The annulment came in 1985 and left Janet back where she had started, except now she was older, a little bruised, and running out of patience for a life she had not designed. What happened next is the part of the story that actually matters most. Janet Jackson fired her father. She removed Joe Jackson from her professional life and replaced him with a new team, new collaborators, and a completely different approach to making music. She flew to Minneapolis and locked herself in a studio with producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and the agreement they made before a single note was recorded was simple. No family interference. No outside input. Just Janet and the work. The result was Control, released in 1986, and the title was not subtle. She was not hiding the meaning. This album was about exactly what it said it was about. Taking ownership of her own life, her own identity, and her own direction. The record connected with audiences on a level that surprised even people inside the industry. It was not just catchy music. It was conviction coming through speakers, and people heard the difference. Hit followed hit. Chart positions that had seemed out of reach arrived one after another. The tours that followed were precise, disciplined, and visually striking. Janet moved with an authority on stage that she had never been allowed to develop inside her own home. The shy little girl who used to hide backstage and bang her head against walls in anxiety was now commanding arenas and setting a new standard for what a live performance could look like. 3 years later, Rhythm Nation 1814 pushed everything even further. The album was enormous commercially, but what set it apart was its ambition. Janet was not making songs purely about personal experience anymore. She was making statements about the world, about inequality, about violence, about what it meant to belong to a society that was failing some of its people. The music had a seriousness to it that critics and fans alike recognized as a major artistic step forward. It produced a record-setting string of top 5 singles and cemented her position not just as a pop star but as a genuine cultural force. By the time the early 1990s arrived, Janet Jackson had achieved something that very few artists in any era manage. She had built a career that stood completely on its own, independent of her famous last name, independent of her famous brother, independent of everything that had been handed to her. She had earned it. The next chapter in her story was quieter and more inward. The Velvet Rope, released in 1997, was the album she made after hitting a wall she could no longer ignore. Depression had been with her for years, circling beneath the surface of every success and every performance. She had talked around it, worked through it, and kept it mostly private. But by the mid-90s, it had become impossible to continue without addressing it directly. The album she made from that place was unlike anything she had done before. It went into loneliness, into desire, into the complicated relationship between control and vulnerability, into the parts of human experience that most pop music avoids entirely. It was uncomfortable in places. It was brave in ways that were not universally appreciated at the time. But it was honest in a way that her earlier records, as powerful as they were, had never quite been. She turned that emotional rawness into a live show that was equally provocative and equally misunderstood by critics who were not paying close enough attention. For audiences who were listening, though, the message was clear. Janet was done simplifying herself for anyone's comfort. Then came the night that everything changed. February 1st, 2004. The Super Bowl halftime show. A moment that lasted less than 10 seconds on screen but lasted more than a decade in the damage it caused. When a costume malfunction exposed her briefly in front of an estimated 140 million viewers, the reaction from media, regulators, and the entertainment industry was immediate and severe. More than 500,000 complaints flooded the FCC. Investigations were launched. And the two artists at the center of it were treated in ways so dramatically different from each other that the disparity became impossible to ignore. Justin Timberlake moved forward. His career continued without meaningful interruption. His next album was a success. His public image recovered. He was welcomed back to award shows, television specials, and radio playlists within months. Janet was effectively shut out. Radio stations stopped playing her music. Television appearances dried up. Networks that had been eager to book her suddenly had no availability. Reports later confirmed what many people had suspected in real time, that she was being actively excluded from platforms and opportunities, a coordinated freeze-out that cost her an estimated $20 million in income, endorsements, and exposure. The album she released that same year debuted strong. The music was good. The sales were solid by most reasonable measures. But none of that could overcome the weight of what had been decided behind the scenes by powerful people who had decided she was the one who would pay the full price for a moment that took two people to create. It took years for the public conversation to catch up to what had actually happened. Eventually it did. Documentaries examined it. Critics revisited it. Timberlake himself eventually issued a public apology acknowledging that the situation had been handled unfairly. But by then, years of Janet Jackson's career had already been spent navigating obstacles that should never have been placed in her path. What is remarkable is not that she suffered the unfairness. What is remarkable is what she did while suffering it. She kept making music. She kept touring. She found new collaborators and pushed into new sounds. She raised a son after giving birth in 2017 at age 50, navigated a painful divorce, and dealt with custody battles that played out in tabloids while she was simultaneously trying to maintain her artistic life. She did all of this without the kind of industry support she had earned and without the consistent media platform that should have been available to someone of her stature. When she released her album Unbreakable in 2015, it debuted at #1 and made her the first artist in history to reach the top of the Billboard chart in 5 separate decades. When she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2019, Janelle Monáe stood at the podium and spoke about her in terms that finally matched the full size of her contribution to music. When her Together Again tour crossed the $100 million gross mark in 2025, selling more than 1 million tickets worldwide, it was not a comeback story. It was a correction. The audience had never actually left. Her Las Vegas residency, which opened at the end of 2024, sold out show after show in a venue that holds 5,000 people. Fans flew in from across the country and across the world. They came because they remembered what she had meant to them and because what she had meant had not diminished simply because certain radio programmers had decided to stop playing her records for a while. When Janet stood on that stage in Las Vegas in 2025 and accepted the Icon Award at the American Music Awards, she was 58 years old and performing on live television for the first time in 7 years. She moved through a medley of her greatest hits wearing a white jacket and looking every bit as focused and commanding as she had at the peak of the 90s. The audience responded to her the way audiences always respond to someone who has survived something and come through it without losing what made them special. But the moment that people could not stop talking about was not the performance. It was the speech. Specifically, those 4 words. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm free. Coming from anyone else, that might have sounded like a nice thing to say at an awards show. Coming from Janet Jackson, knowing even a fraction of what the journey behind those words contained, it sounded like something much more significant than that. Freedom from a father who controlled everything. Freedom from an industry that punished her for a moment she did not engineer alone. Freedom from the cruel words her own family members used about her when she was too young to defend herself. Freedom from the insecurities those words planted and the decades of work it took to slowly dismantle them. Freedom from the box that other people had been trying to fit her into since she was born the 10th child of a family that the world thought it already understood completely. At 59, Janet Jackson is not finished. The residency continues. The music still exists across streaming platforms where it has found entirely new generations of listeners who were not alive when Control changed the rules. The choreography that she still performs with the same precision she demanded of herself at 20 is being watched by young dancers who study it the way students study classical technique. What she finally broke her silence about was not one secret. It was a whole architecture of silence built across a lifetime. The childhood anxiety.